right, let's get focused in on dairy, which I think a lot of people have at least a passing interest in for the state of Wisconsin. Dr. Mark Stephenson is our Director of Dairy Policy Analysis. He's also Director of the Center for Dairy Profitability here at UW-Madison, at least for a little while longer. And his goal today is to try to give us a little bit of a dairy situation and outlook for 2022. Dr. Mark Stephenson.
Well, thank you, Pam. It turns out I do actually have a passing interest in dairy. So let's talk about dairy outlook in the industry this year. You know, clearly COVID's had a huge impact on dairy industry directly and indirectly. I'm almost amused when I look at our average daily cases that this little tiny blip back over here in April of 2020 was what we got all excited about and cloistered ourselves at home. And, you know, now we're looking at something near but short of 1 million cases a day in the U.S. So we may be done with COVID, but COVID's not done with us just yet. When I'm looking at the dairy industry in this year ahead, there are a number of things that I think we have to be cognizant of. Domestic demand. It's actually been quite strong. It's been different. We've done a little bit of different kind of eating, and it's impacted the sorts of dairy products that we want to have, but I'll talk about that. Domestic supply, what a roller coaster. Boy, oh boy, when you go back to that April of 2020, you know, it was overnight, too much milk, got to cut it back. Food box program, not enough milk, we need to increase it. Increase that milk supply, ooh, too much milk. We then have had some farms that have been having trouble, not so much because of prices in a historic setting, but because margins have been tight and we've lost dairy capacity. Export demand's been pretty good, active on all products. Competition has been down from New Zealand and from the European Union, and we've had some export frictions out here. And finally, inflation's been a bit of an issue, and I think will be. So to look at the domestic demand, this is the per capita consumption of all dairy products, or milk equivalent in all dairy products. It's been a good news story for us for quite a few years now, and even this last year with COVID, we've increased our domestic consumption of milk in all dairy products by a few pounds, and that's been a pretty good story. When we take a look at the products that we've increased, this chart is showing you a variety of products that have been general gainers over a longer period of time. The bottom two categories are American-style cheeses and other cheeses. That's been huge for us. Left-hand side of the graph is showing you per capita consumption of cheese of about 14 pounds back in 1975. Today it's more than 38 pounds per capita. Now, cheese took a breather this last year. It didn't diminish, but it was flat in terms of consumption. And a lot of that was because restaurant trade was impacted, and a lot of cheese is purveyed through restaurant chains. Yogurt's been a growth category, a little bit off the last few years, but for the decade prior to that, we were consuming a lot of yogurt. And finally, the top line on there is showing you butter. Now, that's a small line, and it doesn't look like massive growth out there, but when you're comparing butter today against butter a few years ago, butter consumption is way up. So we've had good news story. If you look at this graph, this is one that we all are concerned about. This is per capita, total sales, of fluid milk. And total sales of fluid milk have not been a very good story for the dairy industry since about 2010. Been diminishing pretty steadily. But you'll also notice that as you get down toward that right-hand side of the graph, there was a little bit of a blip up. This was mostly due to our safer at home and eating and preparing more foods there. We went to the grocery store, we grabbed an extra gallon of milk, and we used that. But since we've kind of opened back up again, getting out to some restaurant sales, our consumption of fluid milk is back on that downward trend. Let's shift to the milk supply. This is showing you dairy cow numbers here. Dairy cow numbers have been important for us. We had a good year in the fourth quarter of 2019. That stimulated folks to be anticipating that we should increase capacity, add some cows to the dairy herd. You see that in the fourth quarter of that yellow line. That continued with the purple line in 2020 for a period of time until we got to our safer at home, and we had supply constraints imposed by cooperatives and proprietary plants that just said, we can't take the milk, this is a crisis situation. And farms met that partly by culling dairy cows. We saw a reduction in that. But then, when our consumption was up as a result of farm-to-family food boxes and a really strong need for more milk, farms pivoted quickly. They began to throw more cows into the U.S. dairy herd, and that right half of the purple line increased and continued with the red line on up until about May of last year, 2021. At that point in time, we began to get kind of a binding constraint of poor margins and poor profitability on farms, particularly in the West, and we saw some large farm failures. And you'll notice that we began to decrease cow numbers pretty quickly across the country. Now that peak of the red up there, that was a 38-year high in dairy cow numbers and represents a lot of capacity to produce milk. We've retrenched from that pretty strongly, and I think that that's going to plateau and we'll probably pivot again toward increasing herd size. Milk per cow also changed. This graphic you can see in here in that blue line when we imposed the supply controls on farms. So it wasn't just that we culled cows, we also took our foot off the gas pedal and we stopped feeding cows quite as strong a ration or hot a ration, and milk per cow declined. Curious to me that we are able to put our foot back on that gas pedal again so quickly. As you can see here, from May to June, that increase in milk production per cow used to always be the case where you were pretty sure that when a cow lost the top of their lactation curve, they were done for that lactation. You couldn't get it back. And apparently better feeding and management, we can do that now. You'll also notice, however, the red line, that our yield per cow has been pretty flat the second half of 2021. Again, this is getting back to the high cost of the ration. We simply are not buying as much concentrate to feed dairy cows. So when you look at total milk production or change in total milk production, a lot of up and down. We're comfortable in that 1 to 2% range, but we're actually in negative territory now. So milk is starting to feel tight. If you look around the country, you can see that the Southeast is an old story with milk losses. But in general, the West, which has normally been big and growing, has also had a lot of states in the negative territory. Upper Midwest has been a little bit more in growth area. Export demand's been bigger than ever. The blue line is showing you the percent of milk production that we're exporting. We are in the 17.5% to 18% range now on a month per month compared to year earlier levels. And it's been across almost all categories. We've sold more butterfat, we've sold more cheese, we've sold more lactose, non-fat, and whey. So really almost all of our dairy product categories. And if you look at who the customers are that are buying, it's a bunch of folks. China has been strongly in the market and growing. Mexico has historically been our largest export customer. They stepped back a little bit in 2020, but are back in the marketplace again in 2021. That had as much to do with poor economy in Mexico as anything else. So a lot of growth in many different areas. This is a graph that's showing you the change in percent milk production. The black line is our export competitors all lumped together. Those tend to be New Zealand, the European Union, Argentina, and Australia. The red line is the US. And if you notice clear over on the right, it's in negative territory for all of those export competitors. The red line doesn't reflect the last month or two of the US, but we're now in negative territory, but not as much as everybody else. So we are still a source of supply for dairy products. Port congestion's been a real problem, and that's evidenced by the cost of shipping a container from, say, the Port of Los Angeles to Shanghai. Usually it's been about $3,000. It climbed to $20,000 because you simply couldn't get those things for a period of time. It's somewhat better now, down to about $12,000 to ship that same container, but it's not back to where it should be. I think the port congestion is going to be with us for several years. This is not going to be easily undone, and it's not just a dairy issue, it's that the world moves everything on freighters. The value of the dollar is also gaining strength. That vertical gray bar in the chart, which is hard to see up here, shows you the period that was actually recession at the beginning of our COVID time period for the economy. You might wonder why the US dollar was so strong compared to foreign currencies, but the US is still considered a safe harbor, and people are buying US currency during times like that. That strong dollar may sound like a good thing, but it's not when we're trying to export. It means that our products look relatively more expensive to the buyers. It declined substantially, and through the second half of 2021, it's been gaining strength again. That means that it's a little bit harder for us to export, but I would characterize that more as headwinds, not something we can't get around if our prices are competitive. We're always competitive with powder. We've been selling about 70% of our powder supply in this country as exports, so our prices are always there. Cheese is sometimes competitive, and it has been recently, so we've been moving product overseas a bit more. As a result of that, our butter prices, curiously, are also competitive. We have to make a different product for export than we consume domestically, but we have been selling butter. There have been some of these structural causes of inflation that Paul was talking about. 40 years ago, it was really an energy issue. OPEC was formed in the 60s and began to coordinate and tighten oil supplies, and energy is at the base of everything we do. That increased prices persistently. Today, this cost push that we have is really from labor shortage. We've got some demographics that just have not helped us. The millennials have been doing a calculation that basically said, I think that one of us has to stay home. We're not dual income anymore. We have to watch kids, we have to make meals, we have to make sure they're doing their homework, etc. And some of the baby boomers have been retiring a little bit earlier. Now, all of these things would have happened with or without COVID, but COVID precipitated it at the same time. And this labor shortage is certainly pushing wages up. That's also at the base of everything we do. So I'm going to just say, evaluate your capital investments carefully. This return on investments is what we should be looking at, not calculated asset values that may appreciate. That's what we saw happen 40 years ago. This labor shortage is real, and if we end up with some extra cash at the end of the year that we want to invest in something, I'm going to suggest that we try to invest in labor-saving technologies. We've got several of those that are well proven and more on the way. So my forecast for prices is up. This is not actually as optimistic as futures markets are today. I'm actually quite optimistic, but if you look at futures markets, they would be suggesting something like a $4.25 or 30-cent increase in the U.S. all milk price from last year, which, as Paul pointed out, was not a bad income year for dairy. This is a big increase, and I think is a good reason for optimism, even given the margins that we're facing. Domestic demand has been good, product shifting happening. Still, about 80% of meals being prepared at home. So we've got heavy retail sales and not as much restaurant. Domestic supply, it's a little tight now, particularly in the West, but Don't underestimate dairy producers. If we have these kind of profits, they can pivot a very short dime and begin to produce more milk. Export demand's been strong across all the product categories, and the competition has had trouble keeping up their milk supplies. Some friction, but I think that it's getting better. Take all of those export queues together, we should pick up some world market share here over this next couple of years. Inflation's a big unknown out there. Keep your eye on investments. Don't do those quickly and casually. Think about what you're going to actually invest in. I think this is going to be a good year for milk prices, but we should also continue to look at risk management options. These prices are good right now. Put a little floor under them. That's where we should be. Thank you.